Welcome to the Unraveling the Scriptures channel. When we speak of a people who knew the God of Abraham, the heart of the Christian, the Jew, or even the curious is quickly drawn to Israel. Moses, the desert, Mount Sinai, the Ten Commandments, all of these are deeply engraved in our spiritual memory. After all, it was there, according to the sacred narrative, that Yahweh revealed himself to his chosen people. But what if the story is older than we've been told? What if, before Moses heard the voice of God from the burning bush, others had already bowed before him? What if Yahweh was already known and worshipped by a people forgotten by traditional records? This question is not mere speculation. It's a call to reflection, an invitation to look beyond the surface, beyond tradition, beyond what we've always been told was the beginning. Because there are clues, real, solid, documented, that the God of Israel was invoked by other voices long before the Exodus. We are speaking of an ancient people from dry and mountainous lands who knew the sacred name. A simple people, but deeply spiritual. They called upon Yahweh, revered the Most High, and sought to live according to his principles long before Israel was formed as a nation. Could it be that faith in Yahweh was first sown among other peoples, only to blossom later with Israel? Was the eternal God known since ancient times by those who are now forgotten by history? This revelation does not deny the Scriptures. On the contrary, it deepens them, showing that God has always been the God of all peoples, and that his sacred name does not belong to one lineage alone, but has echoed since the foundation of the world, whispered by the righteous among the nations. If this touched your heart, if it stirred in you a hunger for deeper truth, then I invite you, leave a like, share your thoughts in the comments, and send this to someone who also loves to explore the mysteries of the Most High. Because today, we are about to rediscover a forgotten part of God's story with humanity. They came before the Israelites, even before Moses climbed Mount Sinai, before the tablets of the law were given. It was the Egyptians who first recorded them, not with admiration, but with veiled fear. On the walls of temples, among the hieroglyphs that sang the glories of pharaohs, there were also words filled with disdain, warnings, and mockery. Shasu. That was the name they gave to a Semitic, nomadic tribe of herders and warriors who traveled on foot and crossed the desert with their eyes lifted to the heavens, worshipping a singular deity, Yahweh. Yes, the same Yahweh who would later be worshipped by the Israelites, but the Shasu came first, long before. This people, of Semitic origin, like many others from the ancient Fertile Crescent, were part of the tribes collectively known as the Hyksos, a term that to the Egyptians meant foreigners, invaders, desert thieves. They did not see them as equals. On the contrary, to the Egyptians the Hyksos were a nuisance, an infestation, comparable to lice. But among these foreign tribes, the Shasu stood out not only for their persistence, but for the uncommon worship they practiced. Around 1500 BCE, during the height of the Egyptian New Kingdom, the Shasu walked the inhospitable routes of the Sinai, from the Jezreel Valley to the hills of Kelon, like shadows of the desert. And it's here that the traditional narrative begins to unravel, because these desert men and women already worshipped Yahweh, long before the Hebrews were delivered by Moses. How is that possible? A more conservative archaeologist might ask, preferring to keep all records within the borders of the Pentateuch. But the truth is there, engraved in Egyptian stelae, the names of Shasu tribes associated with the God of Israel. In Western Amara, for example, Egyptian records mention the Shasu of Yu, which many scholars consider one of the earliest representations of the name Yahweh. These people were not Egyptians. They did not come from Nubia, nor from the Delta. They were from the Levant, from the eastern fringes of the Egyptian world, carried by wind and survival. They were organized into clans, each led by a patriarch. And although Shasu was the name the Egyptians gave them, they had other names, ancestral names, perhaps linked to figures who were more than mere men. Patriarchs, tribal leaders, or perhaps intermediaries between men and gods. The word Shasu, derived from the Egyptian Shishu, may mean those who walk on foot. Other linguists suggest the term is related to wander or even plunder. But were these meanings assigned out of contempt or fear? Because if history teaches us anything, it's that victors write the records, but not always with truth as their priority. What is disturbing, and at the same time fascinating, is that the Shasu, despite their marginalized image in Egyptian eyes, carried one of the greatest spiritual secrets of antiquity. Monotheistic worship before monotheism was doctrine. This not only challenges the conventional timeline of the Abrahamic religions, but also raises a haunting possibility. Could the Shasu have been the true forerunners of Israelite faith? There are signs that say yes, and if that is the case, then the Exodus as we know it may not have been the beginning, but rather the continuation of a much older story, one in which the followers of Yahweh had already been walking for centuries, crossing deserts, surviving persecutions, and keeping alive a faith that predated even the birth of the 12 tribes of Israel. The Shasu disappeared from official records around the time of Egypt's third intermediate period. Some say they assimilated into other cultures, others claim they were destroyed. But there are those who believe, with evidence to support it, that they were absorbed into the Israelite people, bringing with them not only cultural and linguistic practices, but also the name and reverence for Yahweh, the God of a nameless people who would later become the very center of the sacred story of the West. The first time the Shasu appear in ancient records, they are not portrayed as allies nor as friends. They appear as enemies of the greatest empire of the time, Egypt. It was in the 15th century BCE, more than 3,500 years ago, that Egyptian scribes first inscribed the name of this nomadic, forgotten people in an unexpected place, on the columns of the Temple of Soleb, built by Amenhotep III, pharaoh of one of the most powerful dynasties in Egyptian history. There, Shasu appears not merely as a generic term, but as part of a list of enemies of the Egyptian crown. Enemies who dwelled in the region of Transjordan, who crossed the desert, and who, surprisingly, were recognized for the worship of a singular deity, Yahweh. What few know is that this record was later copied during the reigns of Seti III and Ramses II in western Amara. In this new version, 6 different groups of Shasu are mentioned. But what stands out, what shakes the foundations of the religious chronology of the West, is one particular title, the Shasu of Yu. Yes, Yahweh, Yahu, or even, as some hieroglyphic interpretations suggest, Yahweh, Iru, or Iago, a name not found among the Egyptian pantheon, a name that would echo centuries later on Mount Sinai. 2 separate Egyptian texts, more than 2 centuries apart, one from the reign of Amenhotep III, around 1400 BCE, and the other from the time of Ramses II in the 13th or 12th century BCE, mention this peculiar tribe, the Shasu of Yahweh. Michael Stewart, a scholar of ancient Near Eastern linguistic and religious traditions, made an observation that still unsettles the guardians of historical orthodoxy. The hieroglyphic transliteration of the name Yu, found in these texts, astonishingly matches the sacred tetragrammaton, YHWH, the very name of God, in the Hebrew tradition. And here lies the real archaeological earthquake. This Egyptian mention predates, by roughly 500 years, what was previously considered the oldest record of the name Yahweh, found on the famous Moabite stone, dated to around 2,800 years ago. This means that the name of the God of Israel, once thought to have emerged only with the rise of Mosaic religion, was already known and worshipped at least half a millennium before the formalized biblical narrative. Scholar K. van der Toorn was unequivocal. By the 15th century BCE, the worship of Yahweh was already established among the peoples who inhabited the mountainous and desert regions of Edom and Midian. Peoples considered peripheral, even savage, by Egyptian and Mesopotamian standards, yet who held a sacred secret, perhaps older than any revelation on Sinai. It is precisely here that the biblical narrative and the archaeological record converge in a surprising, perhaps even uncomfortable, way. Because according to the Old Testament itself, it was in Midian that Moses found refuge after fleeing Egypt. And it was there, among the Midianites, that he met Jethro, the priest of Midian, his future father-in-law, a man who, according to the Bible, taught Moses the ways of God. Read that again carefully. Moses did not discover Yahweh on his own. He was introduced to him by a Midianite priest. If Israel's faith had a beginning, perhaps that beginning did not happen amid the flames of a burning bush, but much earlier, among the forgotten clans of the Shasu, among the Semitic patriarchs who crossed the desert worshipping a god with no image, no statue, no temple. Jethro, a priest of Yahweh, in a land where there were no Hebrews yet. A quiet figure who occupies only a few lines in the Bible, yet carries within himself the weight of an entire spiritual lineage. A very relevant argument that reinforces the idea that the Edomites and Midianites were among the first peoples or tribes descended from Abraham to worship the one God is connected to the figure of Job, a central character in the Old Testament. Job is often identified by scholars as an Edomite ruler, a man of great influence in the land of Uz, a territory associated with the region of Edom. His three friends who appear in the book of Job are also presented as descendants of Abraham. One of these friends, Eliphaz the Temanite, is described as belonging to the tribe of Teman, an Edomite lineage. The Edomites in turn were descendants of Esau, son of Isaac and grandson of Abraham and Sarah. The Midianites, another people mentioned, descended from Abraham through his second wife, Keturah. This shows that both Edomites and Midianites preserved, at least in part, a tradition of faith in the God of their common ancestor. Although it is generally known that over time, many tribes descended from Abraham strayed from the path, adopting idolatrous practices and worshipping other deities, both the scriptures and historical records, including Egyptian traditions, point to the existence of groups that kept the faith in the true God alive. A notable example is one of Job's friends, a descendant of Shua, son of Abraham with Keturah. Though not a Midianite in the strict sense, he belonged to a related tribe that showed familiarity with and reverence for the Almighty God. This context provides a broader view of how knowledge of the God of Abraham extended beyond the direct lineage of Isaac and Jacob, reaching other branches of Abraham's descendants. Thus, even among peripheral tribes, Abraham's spiritual legacy remained alive, passed down through oral tradition and the religious experience of these peoples. In this scenario, one of the most intriguing stories in the biblical narrative is, undoubtedly, that of Moses. After killing an Egyptian, Moses flees Egypt and finds refuge in the land of Midian, a region that today corresponds to the northwestern part of Saudi Arabia. There, he is welcomed by Jethro, described in the scriptures as a priest of the God of Abraham. This encounter reveals something surprising. Even outside the traditional Israelite lineage, there were priests who still worshipped and served the one true God. By marrying Zipporah, Jethro's daughter, Moses forms an even deeper bond with that people and their spiritual heritage. The presence of Jethro as a religious leader among the Midianites, descendants of Abraham through Keturah, reinforces the idea that the knowledge of the true God was preserved among them. This detail is an important piece in the mosaic of monotheistic faith in the ancient Middle East. Beyond the Midianites, other peoples of the region also appear to have maintained some form of connection to the Abrahamic faith. The Kenizzites, for example, are mentioned in the Bible with a degree of spiritual closeness. It is plausible that they were descendants of Ishmael through his son Kedemah, which would give them an Arab origin with ancestral ties to monotheism. This becomes even more relevant when we consider Caleb, one of the spies sent by Moses and a faithful companion of Joshua. Caleb is identified as a Kenizzite, suggesting a mixed ancestry, Hebrew and Ishmaelite, reinforcing the idea that faith in the God of Abraham was not limited to Isaac's genealogical line, but was present in various lineages that originated from him. Another noteworthy aspect is the reference found in ancient Egyptian records to the Shasu, nomadic groups that inhabited the Transjordan region. These texts place the Shasu in the mountains of Seir, a region traditionally associated with the Edomites, descendants of Esau, Jacob's brother. The connection becomes even more significant when these same sources mention the Sinai Peninsula, suggesting that both the Edomites and the Midianites were settled in nearby areas and maintained some level of interaction with Egypt. These pieces of evidence reinforce the idea that various branches of Abraham's descendants, not only through Isaac, but also through Ishmael and Keturah, preserved in some form the faith in the God of their forefathers. When we analyze these accounts from a historical and biblical perspective, we see that the monotheism spread by Abraham had a much broader reach than is traditionally assumed. These elements shed light on the presence and spiritual influence of the Abrahamic heritage among the peoples of the ancient Middle East. In antiquity, it is known that the Sinai Peninsula was inhabited by tribes descended from Ishmael as well as by the descendants of Midian, two distinct branches, yet both connected to Abraham. Ishmael, born of his union with Hagar, and Midian, born of his relationship with Keturah, represent genealogical lines that expanded beyond the territorial boundaries of Israel. However, the presence of Keturah's descendants was not limited to the peninsula. There is evidence that the influence of this people extended across vast areas of what is now Saudi Arabia, showing that Abraham's lineage had a much wider geographical and cultural impact than is usually imagined. Beyond emblematic figures like Moses, Jethro, Caleb, and Job, the Old Testament presents other characters who demonstrate a deep knowledge of the true God, the God of Abraham. One particularly intriguing case is that of Balaam. Although his trajectory in the scriptures is marked by controversy, he appears as someone closely connected to the Midianites and recognized for his relationship with the Most High God. Balaam, although not part of the people of Israel, received revelations directly from God and maintained dialogue with him, making him a unique figure among non-Israelite prophets. Moreover, there are traditions preserved by rabbis and scholars that point to the importance of Beor, Balaam's father. Some of these sources refer to Beor as a king or as the Great Beor, suggesting that he may have held a prominent role as a priest in Midian or even as one of the wise men revered among Semitic peoples outside the Israelite lineage. According to certain interpretations, Beor could have been one of the so-called 7 sages or 7 prophets sent by God to the nations descended from Abraham, peoples who were brothers to the Israelites, and though outside the Mosaic covenant, kept monotheistic faith alive and preserved part of divine knowledge. These messengers would have served as spiritual guides, helping ensure that recognition of the one true God was not lost among the surrounding peoples. But that is a vast and profound topic, which we will explore in a future video. I hope you enjoyed this content about the Shasu, the Edomites, the Midianites, and their faith in the God of Abraham, a faith that, in many cases, even preceded the formal worship established among the Israelites. We've seen how figures like Jethro, Job, Balaam, and others kept that connection with the Most High alive. May God be with you all, and see you soon.